Segment 16A, Russia Gets Started. As the eminent Oxford historian Simon Franklin observes in Russia, Land of the Tsars, Russia is an enormous country. To those of us who grew up during the Cold War, Russia is still one and the same with the Soviet Union, homeland of world communism. To those who grew up after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia is a remote and mysterious country with superpower dreams and a third world living standard. In its heyday, the Russian Empire, which lasted from the 1500s until 1917, which we will study in Unit 4, ruled 1/6 of the world's landmass. The same is true of the Soviet Union, which existed from 1917 to 1991, in which we will study in Unit 5. Both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union became tremendously rich and powerful states. Both exerted a great deal of influence in the world at large. But before we study these empires, we'll need to learn about the Russian peoples themselves. Not just the Russian-speaking Slavs who made up the backbone of the nation and determined its culture, but the awesome diversity of peoples who lived in the lands that we call Russian. In segment 16B, the people known as the Rus. The East Slavs of modern-day Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine come into contact with the Viking people known as the Varangians. Although the Varangians, we believe, became the ruling class, they were eventually assimilated lock, stock, and barrel into the Slavic people. The cities of Novgorod and especially Kiev become the backbone of the culture now called Kievan Rus. The first princes of Kiev, the descendants of Rurik, find themselves alternately trading with and fighting with the wealthy and ancient Byzantine Empire to the south. Segment 16C, The Way of Russia's Elders, examines Kievan Rus society through the actions and influence of three forward-thinking princes, Saint Vladimir the Great, Yaroslav the Wise, and Vladimir Monomach. Each of these rulers saw Eastern Orthodox Christianity as a force for cohesion in the Rus state, and the last two also drew great spiritual strength from their faith. Yet neither wise leadership nor religious cohesion were enough to save Kievan Rus from the social inequity and dynastic friction which laid it wide open for the Mongols. In segment 16D, the Mongol occupation, we examine the Mongol invasion and the time of their control over Rus. Although the Mongols and their successor state, the Golden Horde, were surprisingly tolerant, given their warlike nature, they were very skilled at keeping Rus weak. While the Russian city-states splintered into dozens of ever-shrinking appanage states, the Russian Orthodox Church developed into the focal point for what was left of the Rus identity. There were but two exceptions to this endemic Rus weakness. One was the Republic of Great Novgorod, which fought bravely against the Swedes and the Teutonic Order, but cooperated willingly with the Golden Horde. The other was the Grand Principate of Vladimir Suzdal, which evolved into the state of Muscovy, which in turn evolved into Russia. Segment 16B, the people known as the Rus. In the 6th century AD, as the Byzantine Emperor Justinian fought to reconquer Italy and Africa, a people known as the Slavs first appeared in Eastern Europe. The origin of the Slavic peoples remains controversial. In fact, there's no real agreement on what the term Slav originally meant. But we can safely say that Slavic culture eventually divided up into three groups. The West Slavs eventually settled in modern-day Poland and Czechoslovakia. They came under Western European cultural influence, including the Roman Catholic faith and the Latin alphabet. The South Slavs settled in the Balkans. They came under the rule and the direct cultural influence of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. The Eastern Slavs settled in modern-day Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Unlike the West Slavs and South Slavs, the East Slavs were little influenced by either the Eastern or Western Roman Empire. Instead, the East Slavs developed a unique culture known first as the Rus culture, and only then afterwards as the Russian culture. Originally hunters and traders, the East Slavs benefited from their closeness to a network of rivers, which knit them together like a natural highway system. Eventually, this river network was also used for trade between Byzantium and the peoples of the Baltic Sea. Paradoxically, the story of Rus begins not in modern-day Russia, but in Kiev, capital of the modern Ukraine. We've already learned that a group of Norsemen, best known as the Vikings, had reached the northeast coast of modern Canada around 1000 AD. But the Vikings didn't just sail the west looking for a few good cities to pillage. A Viking group called the Varangians had already been looking at cities and peoples located toward the southeast. Thus, the Varangians came into contact with the East Slavs of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The Varangians also traveled south down the rivers Volga and Dnieper to the lands of the Byzantines. Not being traders themselves, the Varangians' relationships with the Byzantines was simple. Sometimes they fought against the Byzantines, sometimes they fought alongside the Byzantines, depending on who was paying them. For example, the Byzantines recorded that in 839 AD, the Emperor Theophilos hired a few Varangians called the Rhos, R-H-O-S, to fight for him. The arrangement was not unusual, but interesting in that it gives us one, but only one, possible derivation of the term Rus. As with the term Slav, the meaning of Rus remains elusive and controversial to this day. Unlike the Romans, who took their name from a village on the Tiber River, and unlike the Americans, who got their name from a third-rate Italian explorer, the Russians have no clue what their civilization's name really means. But whatever the case, the Varangian influence upon Russian culture is undeniable. The main centers of Varangian influence were two: the cities of Novgorod and Kiev. The Rus culture did not have an extended foundation legend to match the Roman legend of Romulus and Remus. The oldest reliable Russian source is the 12th century AD Russian Primary Chronicle. According to the Primary Chronicle, the Rus culture started in 862 AD, when Slavic tribesmen from Great Novgorod invited the Varangian prince Rurik to become their ruler. Whether Rurik was in fact invited, or invited himself, or whether he even existed, is open to question. But just as the Romans considered Romulus their founder, so the Russians have looked on Rurik as the founder of their culture. Just as Augustus Caesar traced his ancestry all the way back to Romulus, so for centuries Russian rulers claimed descent from Rurik. We don't know much more about Rurik, but supposedly his successor Oleg, who was either Rurik's actual son or was not, captured the city of Kiev on the Dnieper River in 882 AD and moved his capital there. To this day, the cities of Great Novgorod and Kiev proudly claim to be the cradle of Russian civilization. But it's worth noting that the earliest stage of Russian civilization is known as Kievan Rus, and with good reason. Kiev, not Novgorod, remained the center of the Russian state for nearly 3 centuries afterward. When the capital was finally moved from Kiev in 1169, it marked a fracture in the Kievan Rus state. This fracture in turn left the Kievan Rus state fatally open to the onrushing Golden Horde. Oleg ruled from 879 to 912 AD. Although his direct relationship to Rurik is unclear, he was likely a Varangian, because his name is related to the Viking masculine name Helgi and its feminine variant Helga. Oleg may also have been Rurik's brother-in-law, serving as regent for Rurik's son Igor. Besides moving his capital to Kiev, Oleg established a beneficial, if not always friendly, relationship with the Byzantine Empire. He even signed a treaty in 911. Igor, who is either Rurik's actual son or not, does not figure prominently in the primary chronicles. We know, though, that Igor attacked Byzantium twice, 941 AD and 944, and was about to wipe out the neighboring Drevlyanin tribe until the Drevlyanins killed him first in 945. His wife Olga, or Helga, ruled as regent from 945 to 963, until their son Sviatoslav, first Kievan Rus ruler to bear a Russian name, was old enough to be king. Olga got even with the Drevlyanins, thereby making herself the first, but certainly not the last, strong woman to rule the Russian state. Later in life, in either 945, 957, or some other year, she converted to Christianity, taking the name Yelena. She later still became a saint of the Russian Orthodox Church. All the same, her son Sviatoslav remained a happy, cheerful pagan. Sviatoslav died in battle in 972, leaving the throne to Yaropolk. According to the primary chronicle, Yaropolk was in fact Sviatoslav's legitimate son. Yet, Sviatoslav's illegitimate son, bastard son, Vladimir, wound up with the throne. In a legend that would do Romulus and Remus proud, Vladimir first fled to Scandinavia, where he hired some Varangian mercenaries. Returning with his mercenaries in 980, Vladimir tricked Yaropolk into a meeting and murdered him. Not a promising beginning for a future saint of the Russian Orthodox Church. Far to the west, the Roman Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire were increasing their influence. To the immediate west of Kievan Rus, the Catholic nations Hungary and Poland were on the rise. To the immediate northwest were Prussians and other Baltic tribes. To the south of Kievan Rus were Bulgarians and Byzantines. Out to the west, various Muslim Khanites. At the time that Vladimir became ruler, Kievan Rus was just a blip on the world map. By the time he died, Vladimir made Kievan Rus a genuine world power. Segment 16C, The Way of Russia's Elders. By the time Vladimir became Grand Prince of Kiev in 980, Rurik's descendants had ruled over Rus for a century. Having killed his brother in order to become king, Vladimir cared deeply about protecting his own job security. One logical means was obtaining the support of a state church. To this point, Rus had been almost completely pagan, although Vladimir's grandmother, Olga, had converted to Orthodox Christianity. Vladimir himself worshipped a small army of Norse and Slavic deities. As Russian legend has it, in 987 AD, Vladimir chose a state religion for Rus. Vladimir dismissed Islam supposedly because Russians would never accept a religion which forbade them to drink alcohol. Judaism Vladimir discarded because Vladimir could not believe in a chosen people which was driven out of its natural homeland. Western or Roman Catholic Christianity Vladimir found unappealing because the rituals sounded cold and lifeless. Moreover, Vladimir wasn't interested in taking his marching orders from the Pope in Rome. But when Vladimir's emissaries reached Constantinople, they were dumbstruck by the lavish services in the gorgeous Cathedral of St. Sophia. The music was such, the sights and smells and sounds were such, that they reported to Vladimir they couldn't tell whether they were in heaven or on earth. That's how Vladimir is said to have selected Eastern Orthodoxy for the Russian people. No doubt, Russia's close trade relationship to Byzantium had something to do with it too. Vladimir ordered everyone in his lands to convert to Christianity at once, supposedly destroying all vestiges of the pagan religion. Supposedly. The Eastern Orthodox Church was an excellent fit for the Kievan Rus culture. With its complex and stirring ritual, it moved the peasants more deeply than the Western Christians and their focus upon preaching ever could. Because Eastern Orthodoxy traced its roots directly back to Jesus Christ and the apostles, it conferred upon the Prince of Kiev a certain divine sanction. For making such a wise choice and a good career move, Vladimir was later named a saint of the Orthodox Church. His sons, however, weren't very good at loving their brothers. After Vladimir died in 1015, the eldest son, Sviatopolk, assassinated his younger brothers Boris, Gleb, and Sviatoslav. The only surviving brother, Yaroslav, was allowed to live because he was a bastard, and therefore supposedly posed no threat. Yet Yaroslav pushed Sviatopolk out in 1019. Yaroslav brought Kievan Rus to the high point of its culture. Though Yaroslav was friendly with the kings of Western Europe, 3 of his daughters were married to European kings, he was the one who covered all bases by marrying one of his sons off to a little Byzantine princess. Yaroslav was the first to put a Russian in charge of the Orthodox Church, not only declaring religious independence from Byzantium, but establishing that the state was over the church and not the other way around. Yaroslav's crowning achievement was beginning the collection of laws known as the Russkaya Pravda. Yaroslav even developed a complicated succession procedure in which individual Rus city-states were passed not from father to son, but from older brother to the next older brother. Unfortunately, this royal game of musical chairs made Diocletian's concept of the tetrarchy look simple by comparison. Needless to say, it did not long survive Yaroslav's death. Kievan Rus society at its high point contained the seeds of its decline. Officially, Yaroslav's Russkaya Pravda ensured the rule of law, and was in fact comparatively liberal in that it did not resort to the death penalty. But the justice it ensured was far from equal. The higher an individual's social status, the greater the penalty for doing him wrong. The peasants were divided into smerds, or free peasants, zakups, debt slaves, and cholops, born slaves. The free peasants lived in a community called mir, where they took collective responsibility for production and for paying their rent to the noble landowners. The noble class was responsible for providing the prince or grand prince with money and military manpower. The most powerful nobles, or boyars, constantly struggled to maintain their position with the grand princes. As a result, the boyars basically saw the peasants as cheap disposable labor and treated them as little better than serfs. As long as the mir, or peasant community, could provide the nobles with their income, there is no point in bettering the peasants' lives. When the mir could not be forced to provide income, the noble solution was usually force. The Russian peasant, in fact, had it very tough compared to its Roman counterpart. Rich or poor, a freeborn Roman male was a citizen with rights and a stakeholder in the Roman state. Not so the poor Russian peasants, who had no chance of improving their lot in life. They might fight for their grand prince, but resentfully. And the sense of loyalty to the Kievan Rus state was just about absent. The Orthodox Church's ancient literary tradition inspired Kievan Rus to become literate. The grand princes and boyars endowed churches and monasteries, and invited to Rus Byzantine and other architects and craftsmen. The evangelists Cyril and Methodius introduced the Cyrillic alphabet, used first for Old Church Slavonic and then for Russian, and which led to the compilation of Chronicles. The Byzantine influence also included icon painting, an example of how Russians would rather praise correctly, pravoslavye, than indulge in abstruse intellectual speculation. The Russians found God more accessible through ritual than through study or learning. In Kievan Rus, Orthodox Christianity was a strong civilizing force. Although neither the Old nor the New Testaments were translated into Old Church Slavonic, learned men were expected to study gospel readings and historical chronicles. Somewhat surprisingly, the Orthodox Church did not convert at sword point. This taste for tolerance would serve Russia well. Centuries later, Ivan the Terrible conquered the Kazan and Astrakhan Khanates, but continued to let them practice their Muslim faith and helped assimilate these Muslims into Russian life. Simply put, the Orthodox Church played a strong positive role in Rus life. Yaroslav's grandson, Vladimir Monomach, was Kievan Rus's last great prince. A man of deep Orthodox faith, he ruled farsightedly and he left the state in good condition. He abolished debt slavery and he lowered the maximum interest rate to a mere 20%. On the other hand, he promoted anti-Semitism by expelling all Jews from his lands. Vladimir's successors can be judged by their nicknames. Vladimir was himself the single combat man. He was followed by his son Yuri the Long-Armed, who ruled from 1125 to 1157, and who was also the founder of Moscow. Yuri the Long-Armed earned his name by always managing to reach whatever it was he felt like grabbing. Yuri's son, Andrei Bogolyubsky, who ruled 1157 to 1176, was the lover of God. But he didn't love Kiev because he sacked Kiev in 1169 and moved the capital of Rus to the city of Vladimir. Andrei's son Vsevolod ruled from 1176 to 1212. He was known as the Big Nest because he fathered a brood of 12 children. Two of this brood of the children of the Big Nest, Constantine and Yuri, fought it out to be his successor. Yuri won the throne and won the honor of being Grand Prince when the Mongol invasion took place. In fact, such disputes were common in all Rus's leading cities, helping to make Kievan Rus easy picking for the Mongol invaders. Segment 16D, the Mongol Occupation. The Golden Horde was a group of Mongol horsemen who swept in from the Far East in the mid-1230s AD. They conquered almost all of Kievan Rus and dominated it for more than 2 centuries. But they were neither golden in color nor a motley crew of wild men. The Mongols themselves equated the color gold with the direction west, hence the term golden. Horde is the Mongols' own word for a military force, which found its way into the Russian language as Orda, and from there into the English word for an out-of-control barbarian mob. The Mongols were neither barbarians, nor were they out of control. They were ferocious, highly disciplined horsemen who traveled quickly and stopped at nothing to crush their enemies. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan, 1162 to 1228, the Mongols swept out of Mongolia and into China. At the same time, Genghis dispatched other hordes in other directions, towards Egypt, towards Byzantium, towards Persia, towards Hungary, and in 1223 towards Rus. Led by Genghis Khan's grandson, Batu Khan, the Golden Horde, that is to say the Western Force, won a decisive battle against a group of Rus armies, only to be called back to help with the conquest of China. In 1235, Genghis' successor, Ogodai Khan, sent Batu west with roughly 130,000 men. By 1236, Batu's forces reached the Volga River. By late 1237, Batu began picking off, one by one, the great cities of Kiev and Rus. Moscow was sacked and burned in January 1238. The capital of the city of Vladimir was captured and burned to the ground in February. Kiev finally fell by storm in 1240. The only major city to avoid the doom, despair, and agony of Mongol conquest was Great Novgorod, which was farther northwest than the Mongols cared to travel. The Mongols preferred turning west to overrun Poland and Hungary. In 1241, Batu was planning attacks on Austria, Germany, and Italy when he was called home to participate in electing a successor for Ogodai Khan. By 1242, the Golden Horde's age of conquest was, fortunately for Western civilization, finished once and for all. Yet the Golden Horde, or the Kipchaks as they were also known, were not interested in occupying and ruling their new conquests. Bloodthirsty as they had been during wartime, they pursued a hands-off policy after. The Rus princes were allowed to rule their own individual cities more or less as they pleased, provided they paid their taxes, provided they furnished troops for the Mongol army, and provided they paid personal homage to the great Khan all the way back in Karakorum. Although the Mongols contributed very little to Russian culture, they did tolerate Russian ways. They even allowed the Orthodox Church to name a bishop for the Mongol capital city of Sarai. Perhaps they believed that permitting religious freedom would make the Russians less likely to rise up. Whatever the reason, the Orthodox faith kept the Russian people together and preserved the remainder of Kievan Rus culture. As the Mongol Empire began to fall apart, the Golden Horde loosened its hold a little bit. After a while, the Mongols allowed the Russians to collect the all-important taxes themselves. A letter of patent called the Yarlik was granted to one or another of the princes of Rus, making him the great Khan's chief tax collector. The holder of the Yarlik automatically received the title Grand Prince and received the right to use Mongol troops against tax cheats or against anybody else who displeased him. Because Great Novgorod had avoided capture by the Golden Horde, its government was allowed to develop in its own way. In 1136, the boyars there felt grim. Their Kiev-appointed prince had gotten them mad at him. The merchants soon agreed and told the prince he'd need to leave their neighborhood, which he did as fast as he could, ending Kievan rule in Novgorod for good. The city's name became, from that day forth, Great Novgorod, Republic of the North. Back in 862, Novgorod had summoned Rurik the Varangian to be its leader. Although Novgorod soon after took second place to Kiev, it still controlled a wide territory in far northwestern Rus, so remote, as I've pointed out, that the Mongols left it alone. Novgorod was unique for another reason. It was run by a genuinely democratic assembly called the Vyeche. The Vyeche elected a city manager from the local nobility. The Vyeche also elected a prince to command Novgorod's army. When the Golden Horde invaded in 1236, the Prince of Novgorod was a 19-year-old named Alexander of Vladimir. The Mongols weren't interested in Novgorod, but the Swedes were very interested. In 1240, Alexander defeated a Swedish army on the frozen Neva River, thereby earning the name Alexander of the Neva, or Alexander Nevsky. In 1242, Alexander drove off an invasion by the Germanic Teutonic Knights. For all of his bravery, though, Alexander also knew which fights not to pick. He would not be drawn into war with the Mongols because he thought Rus was too weak and too divided. For his wisdom, he was awarded the Yarlik in 1252. Having the Yarlik allowed Alexander to call himself Grand Prince of Vladimir. It also enabled the town of Vladimir to remain comparatively untouched by the Mongol occupation. As it turned out, Alexander Nevsky was right. Thanks to the practice of appanage, Rus was in fact too weak to rise up against the Mongols. Simply put, appanage means that a principality passed from father to eldest son, which with each of the other sons given an appanage carved out of the principality, usually a less important town with its surrounding area. Each of these appanage princes naturally took himself very seriously, passed his land on to his eldest son, and carved out new appanages for his younger son. One result of appanage was a crazy quilt, as you can see from this year map, of appanage princes who could barely pay their own upkeep, let alone pay their taxes to the Khan at Sarai. In many cases, princes transferred their land to the Russian or